right, so thanks again for joining. Turning it over to Ann, class of 1988, who's going to take it from here and give us some more info about renting.
Thank you, Justin. Hi, everybody. My name is Ann Laatsch. As Justin said, I'm class of 88. I was a French major. And then I went to law school a while ago, and I work in the legal services area, the domestic violence world. But I used to do a ton of stuff in the landlord-tenant law arenas. So I'm happy to answer your questions. And and I'm really happy that you guys live in Wisconsin too, because most of the information in here is going to be applicable to anybody, but there's a lot of stuff that is based on Wisconsin law because that's what I know. So I tried to make the text green where it was specific to Wisconsin law. So hopefully that will be clear to you guys. Um, so diving right in, this is what we are going to talk about tonight. We're going to talk about getting ready to rent, things you could do ahead of time before you're actually signing a lease, and then what lease agreements look like and security deposit rules, that kind of thing. Your rights as a tenant. I will admit that my bias is definitely on the tenant side as opposed to the landlord side. So that may come out, but I'm used to representing generally low income tenants. So a lot on tenant rights and responsibilities. And then how to troubleshoot if issues come up during a tenancy, how to end a tenancy, and then some resources that you might use. And I am really happy that you guys want to rent in Milwaukee and Madison because there's some specific resources for those cities that I've got in the last slide. So, what do you want to do if you are getting ready to rent? I mean, obviously, you guys probably know the resources available to help you find an apartment. I usually tell people it's really good just to drive around because a lot of times landlords don't want to pay to advertise somewhere, or they just put up a sign. That's how I found the place where I live. Um, and that gives you a chance to check out the neighborhood as well. But the biggest thing, I think, once you identify an apartment that you're considering renting, would be to check out the landlord. The landlord is going to do a deep dive on you. They're going to do a credit check at the very least, and probably a background check. They may ask you for references. If you're a first time renter, they may ask you for someone to co sign on the lease. So you really want to make sure that you're choosing a good landlord, just like they want to make sure they're choosing a good tenant. So we recommend that you do some research, and I've listed some of the resources here for that. You guys may be familiar with CCAP. It is the Circuit Court Access Project for the state of Wisconsin. That is a website that you can look up. You can look up anybody basically, and find out if they've been in court for civil matters, if they've been in court for criminal matters. So, for example, if you find a landlord who you're thinking about renting from, and you go online and you see that he has filed a ton of evictions against people, that doesn't mean that he is a bad landlord, but it means that for some reason people aren't paying the rent, or there may be conflict there. Like for me, that would be maybe a little bit of a red flag. Um, if you're not in Wisconsin, there are generally other websites in other states where you can access courthouse records. Another really good source of information for landlords is the Department of Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection, datcp.wi.gov. And they are one of the entities in the state that regulates landlords. So landlords have to, like, if you have a complaint about a landlord, that's who you would go to. So they have a database and they can give you information. And I think they'll do it all via email now, on whether or not they've had a lot of complaints about a particular landlord. Building inspection records in whatever municipality you live in are going to be super valuable. You can generally, I know in Milwaukee, where I live, you can go on the city's website, enter any address, and it will tell you the history of code violations in that building, if the owner has ever been fined, if there have been a lot of complaints from other people. Sometimes neighbors complain about the quality or the condition of a building, and that will be in there. That is probably the best resource if you have a specific address that you're looking at. Um, you can also look online at zoning records, and that may seem like a weird thing to recommend, but zoning records will tell you how many people are authorized to live in a unit. Sometimes, I want to say, especially in like college towns, you will find a landlord who's like, "Yep, this is an apartment that is appropriate for 12 people, and it is zoned for 4 or something like that." So even though that is kind of an odd recommendation, it would be great to look at zoning records. Um, Police records, that also might not be intuitive, but it can give you a sense of what the environment is like at the building. If you call the police department and you say, "I'd like a record of," and generally you have to go into the police department, but you can go in and say, "I would like a record of all the calls that have been made to a particular address." And you can tell really quickly if it's an active property where there seem to be a lot of issues coming up. You may not be able to get a lot of detail, but that should be kind of a red flag. Um, and then another really good resource, which is not as easy to locate unless you're looking at a place and the tenants are still there, is current or previous tenants. They're probably your best source of accurate information. A current or previous tenant can tell you how the landlord is at making repairs, if they do it timely, if they're responsive, if they make good repairs, or if they do shoddy work. They can tell you if there's pests in the apartment, what it's like to live in the building and in the neighborhood, if it feels safe or if it's loud. And then it's always nice to find out why the current tenant is leaving, if you have that opportunity. Um, Sometimes there are lots of reasons that people leave, but if they're leaving because of the landlord, that is something I would want to know. So just some suggestions if you're able to contact the previous tenants. So in Wisconsin, before you sign anything with a landlord, there are certain things that they are required by law to disclose. They hardly ever do. And often it's not because they're malicious or they're trying to hide something, but they don't know, right? Um, so it's good to have this list, and don't be afraid to pull it out and say, "These are the things I would like to know before lease," because you have the legal right to know them. Um, First of all, you have a right to examine anything they're asking you to sign before you sign it. They must tell you the name and the address of the person who's going to collect rent. I think that is a law that was written before we did everything electronically, like most people Venmo their landlord or whatever. But they still are required to tell you the name and the address of the person who is going to collect rent. The address can be a PO box, but they have to give that to you. If there's a manager in the building and it's not the landlord, they have to tell you that as well. And they have to tell you who to contact if you need repairs or anything else, an emergency. Um, they also need to tell you who is authorized to accept legal papers. So basically, if you were in a position where you had to serve them, who, if they run a business, is it the manager? Is it an office manager? Is it the owner himself who's authorized to be served legal papers? They also are required to tell you what utilities that you're going to be paying. That should be, I'm sure that's probably one of the questions you would have in the front of your mind, but you can't move in and then have them tell you, "Oh, you guys have to pay the heat now," even though I didn't tell you that. They need to disclose that. They're also required to tell you if they know of any, excuse me, any existing building code violations. Um, that is not one that many landlords are probably going to volunteer. They either may not know about them, or they obviously don't want to tell you, like, right now I have to replace all the downspouts and there's water in the basement or whatever. But they are required to disclose that before you sign a lease. They also, if they're promising to make repairs before you move in, or if they're planning to do that, that should be provided to you in writing. And then finally, they are legally mandated to let you know if there is or has been lead paint in the property. It is getting less and less that you see that because most property owners are abating that issue, but it does happen. So um, those are all the things they are required to tell you up front. And it's a long list, and they'll probably, if you walk in with this list and you say, "Oh, I'm interested in your place, please tell me all these things," they they're probably going to think you're going to be a pain. And if that is what they think, then I wouldn't want to rent there. I mean, if I were the landlord, I think I'd be reassured that you know what your rights are and you want to be a conscientious tenant and you want to protect yourself. So if you ask for these things and a landlord, scoffs at you or something, that would be also a red flag to me. Um, Maybe you guys have heard of earnest money. Sometimes a landlord will say,
Man, this
great
bitch
that you want
sucks.
to.
Oh my God. I'm so sorry. I did not mean the whole table to go.
Oh. um, Maybe they'll say, you know, great that you want to rent the apartment. You have to pay $100 earnest money. All these terms that you might see, application fee, there's a credit check fee, they might call it earnest money, hold money, whatever that is, anything that you pay to a landlord before signing a lease is considered earnest money. And that is your money. If you are not approved for the apartment, if they deny your application, they have to return it all to you, no matter what they called it. The only exception to that is they can withhold the actual cost of doing a credit check, which is up to $25. So if the landlord says no, your credit's not good, or for some reason they decide not to rent to you, then they have to return all that money to you minus the credit check cost within 1 business day if they're denying your application. If they accept your application and you're moving in, um, then they have to apply all of that money except for the credit check cost to your security deposit or your first month's rent. The only exception to this, which I should have put on the slide, is if you pay a bunch of earnest money and you're accepted into the apartment, and then you decide you don't want to rent there. In that situation, they could deduct the cost of trying to re-rent the apartment if they incur any costs related to your refusal to move in. So that is the deal on earnest money. And then avoiding roommate drama. I was trying to figure out where to put this in here, but I think it bears having a little bit of a discussion about roommate issues because rents are so high. And there was just a piece I was telling Justin on NPR this morning about how rents have skyrocketed and they're kind of staying there. Most folks right out of college are going to need to have a roommate or two. I had three, um, if they're going to rent an apartment. So and learn from my experience, it's a really good idea to establish good communication at the outset, and to set your expectations and boundaries before you move in. Like, talk about how you're splitting all the expenses, talk about who's responsible for what within the apartment. How are you going to handle situations with guests? Is it going to be cool if your roommate has a friend staying with you for 2 weeks or for a month? Those kind of things. And then and then just lifestyle issues, like, how do you guys live? How do you spend your time? What are you comfortable being around? What are you not comfortable being around? It's so helpful to have those conversations before you move in with somebody, because you might love somebody, while you're at Carol, and think this is my best friend in the world and we're going to be great roommates. And then when you start realizing it or talking about some of these issues that can come up, you might think, you know what, I think we'd be better friends if we don't actually live together. So, yeah, it's really good to have those conversations ahead of time. So, getting into lease agreements and security deposits. Lease agreements are pretty self-explanatory. Most landlords use a form that is provided by the state. Like, it's going to be a standard lease. It's going to be legal. You'll see like a number on the top of it. and it's just kind of a general boilerplate lease, which is great. Other landlords like to draft their own. We have seen some crazy, crazy clauses. Clauses like the landlord can come in at any time to do an inspection for any reason. That is not legal. A lease provision cannot violate the law. So the landlord can't put a clause in the lease saying, I don't need to give you any notice before I have you moved out, or things like that are clearly illegal. So if you have questions about a lease, I would definitely have somebody look at it before you actually sign it. And there's some resources at the end of this presentation that can help with that. Leases are usually for a year. Sometimes they're longer. And at the end of that year, typically a lease is going to revert to a month-to-month tenancy. So after, and what that means is for the first year, you're under a lease and you're going to be living there for a year. But I like to tell people to think about a lease as a contract. You are basically, if your rent is $1,000 a month, you are paying a contract that you're going to pay that landlord $12,000. So it's kind of a big deal when you look at it that way, which is why you want to be sure that you're renting the right place from the right person. If something comes up and you have an emergency or whatever, and you need to move out before the lease is up, you are responsible for the balance of that rent due for the lease term. So that's kind of scary when you think about it. The exception to that is that the landlord has to make a reasonable effort to mitigate their damages, meaning they have to make a reasonable effort to re-rent the unit and to save you some money if they can. But that is not a risk I would take if you can avoid it at all. So after that year term, typically rents or leases go to month, and a month-to-month tenancy means you have to give 30 days notice before you're going to move out. And that 30 days has to be before, well, I'll talk about that later, but basically just know that sometimes in the lease there will be an automatic renewal clause. And what that means is it's going to be a year lease at a time. And if there is an automatic renewal clause in that lease, then they have to give you notification. They have to give you a little reminder 30 days ahead of time saying, hey, just a reminder, your lease is renewing and we're going to renew it again for a year. And then you have to be provided with a signed copy, a copy signed by the landlord and by you. So if you don't get that, it's good to badger the landlord because you need that. Let's see, what else did I want to say about that? Yes. Yeah, cleaning fees is something you might see in a lease. And that is a little bit of a red flag to me. If a landlord is including a cleaning fee, they really are supposed to show you the actual cost of cleaning the unit, because really otherwise it's just a way for people to make money. So if you see a lease with, something like, I'm charging you an extra $500 because that's the fee for cleaning it at the end. No, you cannot be charged. That's unreasonable. So keep that in mind. Anything that they want that is called a non-standard rental provision. So, sometimes they'll come up with an addendum to the lease, like another form that lists rules or like rules within the property or expectations of the tenant, that kind of thing. Those are called non-standard rental provisions. And I would look at those very, very carefully. Typically I don't see them that often, but once in a while you'll get a landlord who really wants to dot their I's and cross their T's and make sure that you know exactly what the expectations are. So they'll have like an additional form for you to sign. But just remember that if you don't sign something, it is not binding to you. All right. Once you agree to move, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Once you agree to move into a place, you are probably going to pay a security deposit. In Wisconsin, unfortunately, there is no limit as to how much that is. So they could ask you for a month's rent. They could ask you for 3 months rent, they can ask you for, a lot of landlords want first and last month's rent. Typically it's 1 month's rent, but there is no limit as to what can be charged. Sometimes a landlord, when you're a new renter, as some of you will be, sometimes to make themselves feel better, they will require an extra security deposit just because they don't know you and maybe you don't have a rental history that they can refer to. So I wouldn't be surprised if you have somebody who's saying the security deposit is twice the monthly rent. But generally it's about 1 month. They have to give you a receipt for that. And the biggest advice I can give you is when you move into that apartment, walk through and take a detailed video of the condition of the apartment, everything you see, down to holes in the wall, because we've had landlords who will say every nail hole in the wall is a $50 charge, which is ridiculous. But you see it. So walk through, be very detailed, be very thorough, turn on the faucets. If you're looking at a place in the summer, turn on the heat. You want to make sure that that works too. Just make sure everything is in working order and document that with a video before you move in or as you're moving in. And then ideally, your landlord will be willing to have you to fill out a check-in form with you. So a check-in form would just go through room by room and say, oh, there's a crack in the baseboard in the bedroom or things like that. It will document the condition when you move in. That is all to protect you so you get your security deposit back. In Wisconsin, the landlord has to notify a new tenant within that they have 7 days after moving in to notify them of any existing defects or damages. So you have a week after you move in to say, hey, this is some stuff I found. Can you please take care of that? Or that you can also have the right, you do also have the right to request that the landlord gives you a list of everything they charged the previous tenant with. So if they withheld money from the previous tenant's security deposit to repair a window and do X, Y, and Z, you have a right to see what that was so you can check to make sure that work was actually done. Any questions coming up in the chat, Justin? Nope.
No questions yet, but I do want to just add one thing to what you were saying here about the walkthrough or check-in form.
Yeah.
I highly recommend, and I don't know if you've seen this at all or not, but when I rented right out of college, the form was one that you had to, they expected you to write on and turn into them. So I made sure I made a copy of it. I just took a picture with my phone, but scan it, copy it, take a picture of it, do something so that you have it for your own record as well. Because I was nervous, like, okay, I'm just turning this into you. How do I know you're
Yeah.
not going to change it or lose it or something? So if it
Very
is
smart.
a document like that where you don't necessarily have your own copy, make sure you make your own copy so that you have it for your records too.
Yeah, super good advice. It's so much easier now. When I first started doing landlord tenant stuff, like everything was on paper and it was like people would get paper receipts and they didn't have an electronic, record of a payment and things like that. It's so much easier now, but that is really, really good advice. All right, let's talk about your rights and your responsibilities as a tenant. As I said, the landlord has to disclose who's paying for the utilities. That is a requirement, and all those contact disclosures that I mentioned before. Who gets served papers, who you pay the rent to, who to call for repairs, that sort of thing. You also have the right, and this is really important, to contact any authorities about unsafe conditions. So let's say you come home and you smell the gas and smell gas and you're really nervous. You have the right to call We Energies, call the emergency line and have them come out. If there are conditions in the property that your landlord is not repairing and you're having a hard time, you have the right to contact the Department of Neighborhood Services, for example, in Milwaukee. That's where the building inspectors are. The statutes also say you have the right to quiet enjoyment of the premises, which is like an archaic way of saying basically you have that apartment to yourself. Your landlord can't be dropping in. You have the right to privacy and a quiet enjoyment of your own apartment. And then finally, you have the right to not be discriminated against as a renter. And Wisconsin is really pretty good about who is a protected class for purposes of fair housing. So you cannot be discriminated against. They can't refuse to rent to you for any of these reasons: sex, gender, race, color, sexual orientation, disability. For example, if you use a wheelchair and you want to live in a, one of those classical Milwaukee duplexes, they can't refuse to rent to you because they think you're not going to be able to get in the apartment. That is an accommodation that has to be made because you have the right to live where you want. They can't discriminate based on religion, national origin, marital status, or family status. What that means is if you're renting a 2-bedroom apartment and it's you and your child, they can't say, oh, I don't rent to kids or whatever. We don't rent to people with children. As long as the unit is big enough, and it would comply with the building code in terms of the number of people living there and the number of bedrooms, it makes no difference if you're kids or adults or what. They also cannot say that I'm not going to rent to you because I know you've taken out a restraining order on somebody, or you are a survivor of domestic violence, and I heard this and I don't want to have that in my unit. I don't want to deal with that. It sounds like there could be some drama, so I'm not going to rent to you. That is completely illegal. They cannot discriminate against you based on your lawful source of income. If your income is from a legal source, they can't say, oh, I'm not going to rent to her because she's a lawyer and I hate lawyers, whatever. As long as your income is legal, it's not their business where it's from. And then age and ancestry are the other protections. So if you have questions about that, the Wisconsin Fair Housing Council is amazing. Their contact info is at the end of this presentation, and they're really, really great. Tenant responsibilities are pretty much laid out in the lease. Like the lease is going to tell you if you're responsible for shoveling snow or, cutting the grass, if there are quiet hours in the building, that sort of thing. That's all pretty standard. And then obviously cleanliness in the unit is sort of self-explanatory. If there's pests, if you're calling the landlord to complain about roaches or mice or whatever, and the place is really dirty, they're not going to be able to help you, or they won't be able to, that's going to be on you. Keeping documentation of everything, keeping, receipts, or ideally, paying with Venmo or something that gives you an electronic record of your payments. And then document everything. Really, I'm not trying to sound like a pessimist about landlords, but I think that you're doing yourself a favor and protecting yourself if every conversation you have, or every time you have to say to the landlord, hey, can you come fix that dripping faucet? Just keep track of that. And fortunately today with text messages and everything, it's very easy to keep all that. But even if you don't think you're going to need to, just keep a little file and just keep track of communication with your landlord. The other thing that is not obviously not required, but that I strongly recommend is renter's insurance, because it is cheap and it protects your belongings in the apartment, especially when you're in a building where you don't have control over the behavior of other people in the building. Like if something happens, it is so worth the investment, and it's really inexpensive. I think the last time I got it, it was like $200 a year or something. I don't know, Justin, if you have more recent experience, but it's
Yeah. Yeah, so I'm glad you have this on here because it wasn't something that I ever thought about when I started renting, and it was probably in the fine print somewhere that, renters insurance is my responsibility as a tenant, but I wasn't paying attention and I didn't think about it until luckily it wasn't an actual fire, but our fire alarms went off in our apartment once and wasn't an accident. And, you know, it ended up being like dust got in one of the um, smoke alarms or
Yeah.
something silly. But at that moment, I was like, oh my gosh, if this would have been a real fire,
Yeah.
how does insurance work? And that's when I looked into it and I was like, oh my gosh, I'm glad I found out about this. It ended up being like $13 a month or something. So
Yeah. Super
extremely
cheap.
affordable and will definitely keep you, you and your possessions in, in check in case there's anything that ever happens that, as Ann mentioned, that is, can't be your control because you're in a common building shared by multiple people.
Yeah. I see Luke's question. I think they're all pretty comparable, is my understanding of rental insurance. You can choose how much you're going to pay based on your estimate of the value of what you have in the apartment. So if you have a ton of electronics or art or cool bikes or a bunch of stuff, you really want to make a good estimate and then figure out it's basically based on the value, your estimated value of what you own. Um, yeah, I live over here on the east side of Milwaukee, and there was a house that got hit by lightning, and the third floor tenants' apartment went up in flames. They got out fine, but they were on the news saying we just moved in and we were just about to get renters insurance, and so they were, everything was destroyed. So if you take away one thing, that's it. Get renters, document everything and get renters insurance. All right. Dealing with issues that hopefully this will all be hypothetical for you guys and you won't need to worry about issues during your tenancy. But I'd say the most common issue that comes up during a tenancy is repairs and pests. Um, as we're talking about, make all your requests in writing, whether it's by text message or sending them an email. Make sure you date your requests and make that in writing, and then you can let the landlord know if you have a good relationship. Let them know, like, if really this has got to be fixed. I don't want to have to call code enforcement, call the building inspector, but I will if I don't hear from you by X date. You have that right. Um, and retaliating against a tenant for exercising their legal right is illegal. In Milwaukee and in Madison, in Wisconsin, there are programs called rent abatement and rent withholding. And rent abatement means that you have the right to withhold a portion of your rent if if the landlord's failure to make timely repairs has impacted your ability to use your apartment. So let's say you have an apartment and it's a 2 bedroom and one of the bedrooms has no heat, and you've been telling the landlord and they have not brought you a space heater, they haven't had anybody over to inspect it, they haven't made any effort to mitigate that. You have the right to contact building inspection first and then to withhold a portion of your rent that is equal to the extent to which you are denied full use of the property. So, you know, I would withhold, if it was a whole bedroom, if it was half the sleeping rooms in my apartment, I'd probably withhold like a quarter of the rent and say I'm not going to pay this until I have the full use of my apartment. But it's really good to get advice before you do that. There are some housing advocacy groups in in Milwaukee and in Madison. Actually, I think Green Bay too, that can help you with that process. And then rent withholding is a program in Milwaukee and in Madison. I don't know about other communities. It is operated by building inspection. And that is where, if building inspection comes in and they find a bunch of code violations and the landlord is not being responsive, they will have you pay your rent to the city and they will hold it in an escrow account. And and they will release that to the landlord once they make the repairs that are needed. That is a really effective tool, but that has to be done through the city. There's not, I see Luke's question about, is there a way to calculate the exact amount to withhold from your rent? There's really not. You want to be reasonable. There's some case law on this where judges have found, oh, they withheld too much. I think that in Madison, in the Madison City Code, there is a percentage guideline breakdown. Like if there's no heat and it's wintertime, it's 50%, stuff like that. Milwaukee doesn't have an exact breakdown, so it's sort of like your good judgment. There's an organization called Community Advocates that works with people on rent abatement, and they're really experienced with it, and they kind of have a sense of what judges will approve if it ends up going to court. So I'd be careful with it, and definitely work with an organization. But it is the law; you have the right to do it. And then just another, landlord entry. The landlord has to give you 12 hours notice before coming into your apartment. In Madison, it's actually 24 hours, which is great. That is the only exception to that is if they think there's an emergency happening. If they see a fire inside, they don't have to give you notice. But if they want to show the apartment or make repairs, they have to give you at least 12 hours notice. And then just another reminder that retaliating against a tenant for exercising any of their legal rights is illegal. And then let's say you are going to terminate your tenancy. Let's say you're ready to move out, you're going to buy a house or something, or you're moving out of town. The notice that is required for your landlord is going to be in your lease. 60 days is pretty typical. If you are on a month-to-month tenancy, then 1 month is required, but it's got to be a month before the first, it's got to be 30 days before the first of the following month. So for example, I can't give notice on April 15th that I'm going to move out on May 15th. It's got to be from the 1st to the 1st. And then when you're moving out, you want to go back to that check-in form that we talked about, refer to that, and then do a check-out form. Same form, just document the condition, take a video. The Tenant Resource Center, whose website is listed at the end of this presentation, they have really great sample forms and sample letters for tenants, and they've got some check-in and check-out forms. So ideally, you can walk through it with the landlord. If the landlord is not available, then do the same thing. Take a video, once your stuff is out, take a video, document the condition of the property. So you're protecting yourself, and so you have evidence of what it was like when you left. If a tenant abandons property in a rental unit, typically there'll be a section in the lease that talks about tenant abandoned property is usually what it's called. But if you leave stuff behind and the lease doesn't say anything about that, then the landlord has to give you 30 days notice that they're going to be disposing of your property, or they have to give you notice in 7 days. If they're going to store it, they have to let you know within a week. Typically landlords will say after 30 days, I'm just going to throw it away. So best thing is to either leave stuff you don't care about or not leave stuff at all. And then security deposit, they have a month to get it back to you, to return your security deposit. And they need to give you an itemized list of any deductions that they are withholding from your security deposit. And it can't be just random numbers like, well, I had to shampoo the rugs and that's $500. It's got to be their actual costs. And they cannot just charge you for normal wear and tear. Like if a landlord would typically paint between tenants, they can't charge you for that. Now, if you have graffiti all over the walls or something, or you had to have the carpeting replaced because it was so damaged by something you did, yes, you can be charged for that. But normal wear and tear is not chargeable to a security deposit. And if they improperly withhold funds from a security deposit, they can be subject to double or triple damages, meaning if they withheld $100 that they shouldn't have, you may be able to recoup up to $300 depending on where you live. So that's why documentation is so, so critical. And that was super fast. That's pretty much it. These are the resources that I mentioned. The Tenant Resource Center has an incredible website. They also have it broken down by municipality because Madison has some different rules. Fitchburg has some different rules. And you can get all that there. They have really good form letters, like model letters that you might use in communicating with the landlord, and lots of good stuff to read. Fair Housing Council, if you fear that you may have been discriminated against in any way in the rental process, that is who you want to call. They're also a great place if you're ever looking for a volunteer opportunity. I used to volunteer for them, and we would go in as testers, and I would pretend that I was going to rent a place, and I would never know like what the landlord was being tested about, like if it was family status or whatever. And then we got recorded, and we had to give a report on how the landlord acted. They're really, really thorough, and they do cool investigations, and they're a terrific resource. And then the Department on Agriculture, Trade, and Consumer Protection has a wonderful landlord-tenant guide for renters that is available on their website. And finally, the Milwaukee Rental Housing Resource Center is it's kind of the Milwaukee equivalent of the Madison Tenant Resource Center. Great information about landlords, about places that are available in Milwaukee. They can help you troubleshoot, and they can talk to you about rent abatement and rent withholding as well. I don't know. Maddie, are you talking about low income housing, like Section 8 housing? If that is.
Yeah, so I've like contacted multiple places that have like the income restrictions, but
Yeah.
they've basically said since you've been a student within the last calendar year, you are not able to apply for the income restrictions.
Really? I don't
Yeah.
know that, but I can try to find out. I'd be happy
Yeah.
to try to
So
find out.
I mean, I've only been looking in the Madison area, but it's every place I've looked into, and I think they said it was Section 402 housing. I could be wrong with that, but
Okay.
I believe that's what they referred to.
Okay. Yeah, I'll drop my email in the chat and shoot me an email because I would like to know the answer to that.
Okay.
I'll put my email in here. And yeah, that's interesting. Oh, thank you for dropping those links, Justin. That's pretty much what I have. Any other questions?
And I have a kind of an unrelated, kind of related. I just don't know if you have any experience with this at all. What do you do, or what kind of, access or rights does one have if they have a neighbor that is maybe not the best neighbor,
Yeah.
noisy or doing sketchy things, or however you want to define it?
Yeah. Well, if they're doing something illegal, technically, you have the right to complain to the landlord for sure. And if it's interfering with your quiet enjoyment, you have every right to complain to the landlord. And it's that gray area in the middle where it's like, well, they're just jerks, and they burn incense all the time or whatever, like the stuff that isn't illegal but that's really annoying. Depending on the relationship that you have with them, there's organizations that do tenant mediation and that sort of thing. But if someone's doing something illegal or doing something that is perhaps putting the whole building in danger, whether it's legal or like fire damage or anything, you have every right to complain to the landlord. And if they don't, um, and landlords have lots of tools at their disposal to deal with this sort of thing. Like there is a 5-day eviction notice for people who are for tenants who are doing something illegal in the property, that they can just be booted out in 5 days. So they've got ways to deal with it. And if you're a good tenant, it's in their best interest to keep you there and keep you happy, right? So they should want to deal with it. But it can be tough. I would just document and video and all that kind of stuff and take that to your landlord. And then if they don't do anything, you know, there's not a lot that you can do, you know, which is probably not the great answer you were looking for, but yeah, it's challenging. Let's see another. Oh
What
yeah,
are
go ahead.
what are some of the best questions that you should be asking your landlord when you first find your apartment?
Oh, that's great. Um, I would like to know if the landlord lives in the neighborhood. Like, they don't have to, they aren't required to tell you their home address, but I would like to casually say, "Oh, do you live in the neighborhood? Like, what's the labor neighborhood like? Do you like it?" Or um, I would ask them what the best way to contact them. What's their preferred manner of being contacted? Do they want a phone call? Do they want an email? Do they want a text? Um, and I would just be really careful to ask questions that displays that you know what your rights are, because you want to find a good landlord. I'm renting right now. I have a great landlord, and I feel really lucky, and that and I know that he wants to keep me here too, which is cool. I'm trying to think what else I would ask a landlord. I would
Sorry,
ask,
could I ask
yeah.
for a clarification? Were you saying that I should let them know that I'm aware of my rights or as a tenant, or to be wary of that because
No, I would ask questions that will show him that you know what your rights are, because
okay, and see how he reacts or he or
yeah,
she reacts to it for they.
yeah. And if that scares them
Okay.
off, then that should be a red flag right there. But I would ask about turnover in the building. If it's a multi-unit building, I would say, about how often do these units turn over, because that can be pretty informative for a potential renter. Um, if there are other lifestyle things, like, are they aware if it's a quiet building or a noisy building, or what is the age of the other tenants in the building, that kind of thing. Um, I think the Tenant Resource Center actually has a handout on that, like interviewing landlords or something. I feel like I saw that. But I think the more like pointed questions you ask, the more they're going to know that you're responsible and that you've done your homework. And that would make me want to rent to you. But I would like to think that I would be a good landlord. Hannah has another. So they will generally, Hannah asked a question about, what if you haven't established credit yet? Obviously, you are not alone in that. Most college students are going to be in the same boat. And depending on where you rent, like I live near UWM. I know landlords don't worry a lot about that because they assume nobody has credit. They may ask to have somebody co-sign your lease for you, like a parent or guardian. Um, they may ask for a extra security deposit or an extra month's rent, that kind of thing. But you definitely don't have to have established great credit to apply for an apartment. I think if they know your situation, they're going to be more understanding. Or like I said, maybe ask for a co-payment. And then tell me what you mean by, what do I do to start that part of the application? Like, do you mean the credit check part?
Also, while Hannah is clarifying, I don't know if you mentioned this, Ann, because I was browsing through the resources for tenants on that website, which is
Mhm.
fantastic, by the way.
It's so good.
Um, I know when I started renting and didn't have credit built up to have a proper credit check done, they had asked for a pay stub from my employer to kind of verify income. So
Oh
I'm
yeah.
not sure if you mentioned that or not, but that might be something else that you experience.
Yeah. Um, oh yeah. So building credit, that is great. And I think actually, didn't you do a session on this, Justin? Because I'm not an expert on this.
A little bit.
Um, but yeah, I think, just paying your rent on time. If the landlords generally don't report to a credit reporting agency unless you are evicted, unless you don't pay your rent. So just having a stable record as a tenant is going to be helpful to you for sure. Um, and then I know that you can apply for like secured credit cards to sort of start building your credit, if that's still a thing, where like you deposit $500 in an account and you get a credit card and you use it. It's more like a debit card, but it helps to build your credit. I mean, I think the best thing you can do to build credit is to borrow money and pay it back quickly, or, pay it back timely and pay it back in full, whether that's a credit card or a loan or that kind of thing. Um, Finding apartments, yeah, I recommend looking online. Zillow you can look up apartments on Zillow. It has a rental feature, not just a home buying feature. Um, but also, I always tell people to go out and drive around areas where they think they might want to live, just because you're going to get a good sense of what the neighborhood is like. You might run into somebody you can ask, like, how do you like living here? That kind of thing. Um, and then I don't even know, is Craigslist still a thing? Used to be Craigslist.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, I think there's a ton of rentals on Craigslist. I haven't looked at that in a long time.
Facebook Marketplace too, I think.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Facebook. That's
Yeah.
that's a good point. Um, and then typically your rent should be about 30%. That's a very good question. I should have had this in here. You want to budget that your share of the rent should be about 30%, no more than 30% of your income. Like roughly a third of your monthly income. And then you got to factor in utilities and all that kind of stuff on top of that. Best places to find roommates. On you guys maybe don't have an app called Nextdoor yet, because that's more like I don't know, kind of a homeowner app. But I see a lot of posts on Nextdoor, people looking for roommates. And I would check that, and also Facebook. Like most neighborhoods that you're looking in, like the UWM area has a Facebook group, and I see people looking for roommates on there. I would say on social media, um, and on the Nextdoor app.
All right. Well, if you still have questions, please feel free to stay. But I want, while everyone's still here, to again thank Ann so much for being a part of this webinar today and for providing all of this information.